Oh, that's right, you're the,
Wait, I don't want it to record right now.
oh, you're doing it here, today.
Wait.
I don't know how to do it, but I'll be.
No, I'm trying to, it's hard to get my menu down. Trying to get my menu. My menu, no. Oh, wait, me.
Jeffrey's unmuted himself yet.
Well, good evening. It's nice to see those of you joining us online, and we will get started here in just a couple of minutes. Very much looking forward to our presentation and discussion this evening. We'll be talking about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And of course, I included the outline for the book with my email. So I guess everybody's seen that and hopefully downloaded it. So we'll go through that. And as I'll mention at the outset, it's a very, in some regards, rather dense book, a lot to talk about, and we have a limited amount of time. So we'll just try to cover as many of the main points as possible. But again, wonderful to see you all. So we'll start here in just a moment, just a minute or two. Thank you.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone in person and on Zoom. I see a faithful following there. So from Toccoa and all over, and we have a guest tonight with us from San Diego. So this is great in person. I'm Millie Atkinson. I have the privilege of serving on the board with Dr. Brashears, and he asked me to open tonight. I really don't have any announcements other than last week I also mentioned about the Mama Bear Apologetics, which will be at Mount Bethel on Thursday, August 28th at 7 o'clock. So if you're interested, especially if you have young people in your life, children, grandchildren, certainly young parents, men and women are all invited to come. and hear. It's a great book, and just to equip our kids, it says empower kids in your life to think, discern, and stand strong. And I know we all want to do that. So that is at Mount Bethel, which is right around the corner from Johnson Ferry. So Jeffrey might have some other announcements, but I'll go ahead and open us in prayer and we will get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you have blessed us with. We are mindful that each and every day is a gift from you. May we never forget that you have placed us here for this moment in history. I pray that you will equip us through your Spirit to be the people that you have called us to be, to bring your hope and your love into this dark and broken world. I thank you for Jeffrey and this ministry, and that we can all come alongside him and be a part of it. What a privilege that is. And I ask your blessing on him tonight as he teaches us. It is, again, a gift to be here. We never take for granted living in this country where we can meet together and worship you and speak your name. So I ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Well, good evening. Very, very good to see you all and those joining us online as well. So very much looking forward to this will be our first presentation on one of the great books of the last 50 years. And it's quite how many of you have actually read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning? So, okay, quite a number. And you know that it's actually quite a dense book. I mean, not dense in the sense of hard to understand, but there is a lot of content in it. And so we'll do our best to hit some of the major points. Hopefully you received and downloaded the outline for this evening so you can follow along with us. And so I'll go through it as expeditiously as possible. But again, any relevant comments or questions you have, don't ever feel like those are interruptions, not at all. I really value that kind of input. So anything before we get started? Any questions or anything? All right. Well, let's get into the material then. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And there's one quote that surfaces a couple of times in the book, which he emphasizes, and it comes strangely from somebody who was a militant atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche. Not only was he a militant atheist, but he was also, he hated Christianity and was what we would call a nihilist or a nihilist. In other words, he believed that life had absolutely no meaning and purpose whatsoever. And basically, even though we think that our lives have meaning and purpose, according to Nietzsche, you know, that's just wishful thinking. Our lives have absolutely no reason. We're just flukes and accidents of the universe. So having properly introduced Friedrich Nietzsche, as I said, there's 2 or 3 quotes in his writings that show up in this book, including one that's featured a couple of times in which he wrote, quote, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." In other words, does that make sense? If you have a reason, if you think you have a reason for living or functioning in the sense that you are, you can deal with almost any adversity, basically. Now, that doesn't sound very nihilistic, but remember, nihilism is a lie. And so there's, in every philosophy and every religion, there's some truth, but there's also a lot of lies. And so even somebody like Nietzsche is capable of blurting out a truth from time to time inadvertently, okay? So he who has a why to live, why am I alive, can bear with almost any how. In other words, deal with all the adversity in life and so on. All right, so a little bit about the author, Viktor Frankl. He was an Austrian neurologist. He becomes a psychiatrist after World War II. He's rightly considered a philosopher. He's a well-known author. He was also a Holocaust survivor. He spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. And to survive 3 years in those concentration camps, the odds were extremely small, to say the least. In 1948, just 3 years after World War II, he earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Vienna. After that, he becomes a professor of neurology and psychiatry at the University of Vienna Medical School. His primary contribution to psychotherapy was his development of a new system of psychoanalysis that he called logotherapy. And that was a psychological theory based on the premise that mankind's primary motivational force is the will to meaning. In other words, the idea that we have a purpose in life is what is our primary motivating factor. That's what logotherapy was all about. And we'll contrast that with the 2 other major dominant streams of psychological theory at the time. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, we think of him as emphasizing what we would call the pleasure principle. In other words, if you're going to make it through this life, you need to seek as much pleasure and minimize as much pain and adversity as possible. Okay. And the other great philosopher, in contrast to Sigmund Freud, was Alfred Adler. And Alfred Adler did not emphasize so much the pleasure principle as he did the power principle. In other words, that the only thing that provides motivation and drive for us in our lives is manifesting as much power and control over our lives as possible, which means as much power and control over other people as possible. Okay, so you've got Freud, the pleasure principle, and you've got Adler, the power principle. And then Viktor Frankl comes along and he provides an alternative to both of those psychological theories. Now, unlike most psychological theorists, Viktor Frankl understood that fulfillment in life comes through dedication to a cause outside of oneself or greater than oneself. Say, well, that's certainly compatible with Christianity, isn't it? And we'll talk about how that he was apparently a pretty serious traditional Jew, and so that would be compatible with traditional, Judaism as well as Christianity as well. And that is that our primary purpose in life is to serve a cause beyond just our own egos. And whereas Freud and Adler, they're emphasizing ego fulfillment and everything, he's saying, no, that's the wrong track. We need to serve others. And in the process, that's how you develop a quality life and a satisfying life. So he puts it this way. I admonish my students, he said, do not aim for success. Boy, that's countercultural, isn't it? Do not aim at success. The more you aim at success and make that your target, the more you're going to miss it, because nothing in this world really satisfies, does it? He goes on to say, for success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must instead ensue. In other words, it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. So his whole concept here is that there are great, I would say, great truths with which we need to align our lives. And that should be our primary motivating factor in life. And also serving others and loving others. And that is what will ensue with a life in which it's regarded as fulfilling and so on. So by calling his readers to a cause greater than oneself, he implies, though, that that cause should be true and good and beautiful in keeping with the Platonic, triad. So our cause for which we're living should be true and good and beautiful, honorable, righteous, and so on. So over the course of his career, he writes more than 30 books. He writes on philosophy, psychotherapy, neurology, and Man's Search for Meaning is his best-known book and one of the most influential books of the 20th century. And it's a book that sold almost 20 million copies by the turn of the 21st century. So it's had a great impact on an awful lot of people. All right, now, if you're following along there, his spiritual orientation, it's sort of hard to discern reading through Man's Search for Meaning exactly what he believes about God and true spirituality and so on. So I had to do a little bit of research outside that. And what I realized was that he is an existentialist. He believes that we manufacture meaning in this life through the course that we follow, okay? But he's also influenced by the Jewish faith. And so he's a Jewish existentialist. He believes we need to discover meaning and purpose in life through our own intuitive senses and our own unique life experiences. Now, is there anything about that that's questionable or contrary to what Scripture teaches? Let me say, for instance, we need to derive meaning and purpose in life through our own intuitive senses. Does that correlate with Scripture as far as you know? Now, of course, that requires some explanation, doesn't it? Depends on what exactly he means by that. But is it innately contrary to Christianity? Bruce, you
Well,
were.
the Christian answer is we get our essence from being a child of God.
Yes.
And those is our rationality and our understanding of morality and so we come that way.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important thing for people to understand. I fought with definitions of stuff. I was a French major and I read all the existential writers, figured out what the devil they were talking about. The issue is the dichotomy, the bipolar thing of essence brings existence. And so we believe as Christians that we're born with an essence or something, there's some way in which you are, your rational, moral, being, you fall, and there are also divisions that go into that, but that's part of your essence.
Mm-hmm.
Existentialists believe that essence is something which is manufactured. It's manufactured by the way you react to existence.
Mm-hmm.
So my good old French teacher in college, graduate school, would say, to an existentialist, it didn't matter whether you pushed a little old lady in front of the bus or whether you rescued her from going to the bus. It was your action which created your being. Right? You built that.
Mm-hmm.
That's of course a British term, it's a highly to nothing. You don't get anywhere with that at all.
Yeah.
So it's probably you and I would talk to what's the name, the sociologist from Kennesaw.
Oh, Melvin Fine.
Melvin Fine.
Yeah.
Richard Howe and I, and
Yeah.
he denied that there was any such thing as a human essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he lived his life in general contrary to that because it's a lie. And so this idea that we have an intuitive sense that certain things are right and wrong, good and evil, whatever, there's nothing unbiblical about that. In fact, in Romans chapters 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul talks about what we would call in theology the sensus divinitatis. In other words, we're born with a sense that there is a God or something beyond just the natural world that we are in some way or another subjected to or subjective to. And so a lot of his thoughts, again, he's not really ever in this particular book, he's not outright pushing Jewish theology, nor is he pushing Christian theology, but a lot of what he says certainly is compatible with biblical theology in a general sense. Now, unlike most modern existentialists, like you were referring to, Frankl was neither an agnostic nor a secular humanist. He believed in a personal and transcendent God, not an impersonal cosmic force or some kind of pantheistic divine spirit within each individual. So he does believe apparently in a transcendent God, which again is very much in keeping with traditional Judaism, isn't it? So, and likewise, in keeping with traditional Jewish theology, he believes that God cares about humanity and that individuals can connect with God through prayer and through faithful living. So again, as far as that takes you, you know, that's certainly compatible with Christian beliefs. Now, unfortunately, though, Frankl wrote nothing about mankind's inherent egoistic nature, which we typically call what? Sin, well, or sin nature. So he writes nothing about the fact that inherently we have an ego-centered, sinful nature that needs spiritual regeneration. That's a major issue. That's a major problem. But again, he can take us pretty far in the direction of God and biblical concepts, but he's not going to take us all the way, to say the least. All right, now, in terms of psychoanalysis versus logotherapy, the next section there in your notes, let me talk for just a moment about the two classical schools of Viennese psychology or psychotherapy. And traditional psychoanalysis, as practiced by Freud and Adler and numerous others that we could cite, is basically retrospective. In other words, hearkening back to your earlier life, including your childhood and childhood traumas and things like that. So it's retrospective. It's also very introspective. It's more focused on finding oneself. In other words, trying to determine who and what you are rather than who and what you can be. Now, who and what you can be, that's what Frankl would call our calling in life. And that's what we need to be focusing on, not childhood traumas and dramas and, you know, all that sort of thing. Now, Sigmund Freud developed his philosophy of psychoanalysis based on a naturalistic, godless worldview. And of course, he was very explicitly, you know, atheistic and all. Freud's approach to curing neurosis was to focus on the anxiety caused by conflicting and unconscious motives that we all acquire through life. Okay. His psychoanalytic philosophy was rooted in what we call Epicurean philosophy. If you go back to ancient Greece, Epicureanism was one of the popular philosophies of the day. And Epicureanism was all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And to the Epicureans, that's what constitutes a quality life. Okay. It emphasizes the pleasure principle and the gratification of basic drives and instincts. And these drives and instincts are manifestations of the pleasure principle. In particular, of course, Freud will focus on the sex drive, and that becomes a major issue that defines a lot of his psychoanalytic philosophy. Therefore, psychoanalysis tends to be very self-absorbed. In fact, it becomes very self-obsessed. And I don't know if you've had much personal experience, you know, with psychoanalysis or know people that have. but it can become just excessively self-absorbed and self-obsessed. And that's exactly what Viktor Frankl is saying we need to transcend, okay? The pleasure principle is actually just a servant of a more comprehensive principle, which is what Freud called the homeostasis principle. In other words, the ultimate goal for Freud was tension reduction, reducing the tension, in our lives for the sake of achieving and maintaining inner equilibrium. Well, that's fine, but that doesn't really address the root problem, does it? The root causes of the problems that you're facing in life in terms of trying to define your calling and purpose and meaning in life and all. Therefore, given Freud's naturalistic, materialistic worldview, he had a very mechanistic approach that viewed the therapist as some kind of a technician and the patient as some kind of a machine. Viktor Frankl writes, quote, Freudian psychoanalysis views the human psyche atomistically as pieced together out of separate parts, out of various drives. He goes on to say psychological phenomena are therefore reduced to subconscious ego drives and instincts, and thus are totally determined and caused by them. That was alarming. Buzzer just went off here in the building. So in other words, for Freud, human behavior is merely a byproduct of deterministic instinctual desires, as in the case of the entire animal world, when you think about it. So basically, we're only highly evolved animals, according to Freud. And his psychoanalysis theory pretty much confirms that we're just highly evolved animals. In other words, we have no free will to transcend our basic instincts. And furthermore, we have no soul for that matter. So Frankl writes this way, what is missing in Freudian psychology is the human reality, which I've come to call self-transcendence. So what Frankl's going to be arguing in the book is that, look, we need to transcend all of our ego-centered, psychodramas that we've experienced throughout life and realize that we're here for meaning and purpose. And that needs to be our focus, not focusing on, the traumas of our life up to this point. Frankl goes on to say, we realize that we can only actualize ourselves to the extent that we transcend our ego-centeredness and give ourselves to serving a cause higher than ourselves or loving another person other than oneself. Truly, he says, self-transcendence is the essence of human existence. Okay. So again, the bottom line, we're here for a purpose. And ultimately, as Christians, we understand that purpose is to serve God wholeheartedly and also love others, as we love ourselves. But that's just totally contrary to the dominant themes in mainstream psychology. And, when we go back to the birth of psychology and sociology in the late 1800s, psychologists and sociologists always want to emphasize the scientific basis for their field. But actually, there is, as C.S. Lewis wrote about in Mere Christianity, there is a science of psychology. But psychology is mostly, in fact, oftentimes overwhelmingly, it's not science, it's philosophy, and it's bad philosophy. Okay. And you might say the same thing about, most every field of study, history. Our history, how do we interpret history? Well, it's based on our philosophy of history and our value system and so on. There are facts of history, but history oftentimes transcends into philosophy based on our worldview. All right, so Sigmund Freud, let's dispense with him. Now, similarly, the second of these two influencers in the field of psychology was Alfred Adler. And Alfred Adler certainly did not emphasize in any way self-transcendence. Viktor Frankl puts it to us this way. He says, Adlerian psychology was all about overcoming a certain inner condition that we all have, the feeling of inferiority. Think about that. Growing up and all, and even into your adult years, do you have these recurring senses that in certain ways you're deficient and inferior to others? And so with Adler, psychology is all about helping us overcome those feelings of being inadequate, inferior, whatever, which Adler tries to get rid of by developing the striving for dominance and superiority. Now think about narcissists. And there are several who appear in the news on a regular basis. Sure, you've noticed. But the point is that for somebody who is beset by an inferiority complex and all, how do you overcome that? Well, the human response typically is to try and dominate other people or show that you're superior to other people, maybe superior physically or intellectually or in your ability to make enormous amounts of money and things like that. So he says, it's all about striving for dominance and superiority, a concept that is congruent with what Nietzsche called the will to power. And as with Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler denied the reality of individual self-determination or free will. In other words, we're just animals and we respond to the impulses and all that we receive, just like animals do. We do not have a soul. We don't have a true conscience. And so we just, accept that. And so, again, try to live a meaningful life by exerting your power and influence and authority over others and all. Now, Adlerian psychology, with its emphasis on the power principle, to me, is more in touch with reality than Sigmund Freud's pleasure principle. Now, both of them are very flawed, but I think the power principle is more in touch with reality than just Freud's pleasure principle. Now, think about, for instance, The Lord of the Rings, the great novel series by J.R.R. Tolkien. And in The Lord of the Rings, it implies that the lust for power and control over other people and the lust for power and control over nature is the ultimate obsession of sinful humanity. And that's what, remember the Lord of the Rings. Now, there's like 9 rings of power or something like that. But the ultimate ring, the one that rules over all of them, is what? Do you remember? It's ultimate power, basically. That's the one rule, the one ring that rules over all the others. So I think Tolkien probably was aware of Alfred Adler and his power principle concept, and Tolkien, I think, integrates that into his great Lord of the Rings trilogy and all. All right, so let's move on. I've had enough of both of these, Freud and Adler. Any comments or questions you might have before we move on to things that are a little more in touch with reality? Anything? All right, so let's take a look at the alternative that Viktor Frankl proposes, and that is logotherapy. So in contrast to Freudian and Adlerian psychology, logotherapy is meaning-centered psychotherapy, meaning-centered. In his psychotherapy practice through the years, Frankl would sometimes ask his patients who said that they just had no reason for living and, life was just a dirty joke and, most of them wouldn't believe in God, but if they did, they'd say that he's a horrible person. So to people like that, Frankl would sometimes ask these patients, okay, well, why don't you just commit suicide? And that would be the ultimate act of resistance against, God and so on. So why don't you just commit suicide? If you're convinced that your life has no meaning and purpose at all, and life is very hard, we've all noticed, just commit suicide. And yet they don't want to do that. And I thought, well, a lot of people in that state, of course, wouldn't want to do that because they're afraid of what might ensue after they die. But on the other hand, I think it defies the whole idea that anybody totally believes their life has no meaning and purpose and value whatsoever. Okay, they're just using that as a cover for the way that they're choosing to live their lives. So in logotherapy, only human beings who are unique among all the species have any sense of meaning and purpose in life. Now, the Bible asserts that having been created in the imago Dei, in the image of God, only human beings have a soul. God created us not only with a rational mind, if we'll use it, and not only did he create us with creative and imaginative potential, if we'll use it, and not only did he create us with an innate moral conscience, but also he created us with the sensus divinitatis, as I mentioned a while ago. In other words, the natural capacity to sense or perceive the reality of God. And again, the Apostle Paul, addresses this in Romans 1 and 2. So what exactly is logotherapy? Well, Viktor Frankl defines it this way. He says the word logos, the Greek word logos, denotes meaning. And logotherapy focuses on the meaning of human existence and man's search for meaning and purpose. Now, that's actually kind of an eccentric definition, because in classical Greek, logos actually meant the word with a capital W. And it implied that what we're talking about here is the ultimate principle of reason with a capital R, or the ultimate principle of reality with a capital R that governs the universe. So living in accord with truth and reason correlates with the meaning of life. Okay, that correlates quite well with Christian theology. So Frankl believed that some neuroses are rooted in a lack of meaning or any sense of responsibility in life, but both Freudian and Adlerian psychology discounted any higher aspirations of the human psyche beyond merely seeking pleasure or seeking power. So that's why he develops this alternative theory to theirs. He puts it this way: logotherapy deviates from psychoanalysis insofar as it considers man to be a being whose main concern consists in fulfilling a meaning in life, rather than in the mere gratification and the mere satisfaction of, pleasing his drives and his instincts. He says logotherapy transcends mere Epicureanism, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Sometimes we have to endure pain for a higher purpose in life. Therefore, he says, logotherapy, in contrast to Freudian and Adlerian psychology, logotherapy is less ego-centered. It focuses on what should be our primary motivational force in life, and that is devotion to a cause beyond ourselves or a devotion to a person other than ourselves. And in contrast to psychoanalysis, logotherapy recognizes that tension between ego fulfillment and devotion to a higher purpose is an indispensable prerequisite for mental health. So he would go on to say both mental and spiritual health depend upon our commitment to a cause beyond our own egos, beyond our own selves and our own agenda and so on. So striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal requires positive changes and transformation in terms of how we think and how we live our lives. Again, nothing could be more compatible with, Christian theology than that idea. So what are the main symptoms of a self-centered orientation? Well, he says self-centeredness or egocentrism is manifest in boredom, because nothing we can achieve in this life or nothing we can own in this life really suffices or satisfies, does it? You always realize that no, that provides no ultimate satisfaction. And so you keep striving for more and more, but it doesn't work. So self-centeredness, egocentrism is manifest in boredom. It's also manifested in anxiety, depression, aggression, and also addictions. An obsession for power, for money, for social status, for pleasure, and for self-recognition. Also, he says, the sexual libido becomes rampant in the existential vacuum. So for many people, they try to derive meaning in life through sexual expressions and all. So he goes on to talk about how, if we're not God-centered, essentially, then we are going to have a sense of emptiness in our lives, what he calls an existential vacuum. And that oftentimes manifests itself in terms of boredom in life and apathy in life as well. Our lives seem to have no real meaning, and we become very, very frustrated. He says this can lead to all kinds of addictions and aggressions and depression as well. All right, so
Sorry for the interruption, Jeffrey. We have no audio. I don't. This is Margarita.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, now I do.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how that happened.
Yeah, the audio went out for a moment.
Has that been for several minutes?
At least a minute, I'd say.
Yeah.
At least a minute. Okay. Well, I'll be sure and double check and make sure that the microphone is active. So thanks. Appreciate
you're
that.
welcome.
All right. So the point I was merely making there at the end is that Viktor Frankl challenges readers to transcend egocentrism through what he calls self-transcendence and the pursuit of worthwhile goals, the most worthwhile being, acknowledging that ultimately we serve God wholeheartedly. That's our priority in life. Frankl fails to acknowledge, though, that egocentrism, in other words, sin, is inherent in human nature and can only be overcome through genuine spiritual conversion. In other words, it can only be overcome through heartfelt repentance and submission to divine guidance through a deep love for God and faith in Jesus Christ. As Jesus taught, in order to fulfill our ultimate purpose in life, you must be born again. So this is what's missing, and it's a critical omission to say the least. But what he is a very astute critic of the dominant philosophies that rule in the field of psychology. Okay, so again, any thoughts on any of that before we move on? Yeah, Bruce.
Interesting because looking at their dates, Frankl lived for almost 50 years beyond Freud and Adler.
Mm-hmm.
And so they died in the late 30s.
Late 30s, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the 20th century coming out of the 19th, Christianity had probably the biggest bashing that it probably got in history, primarily from the materialists.
Mm-hmm.
And the scientism sort of people and positivists, so forth.
Yeah.
And so when you look at Adler and you look at Freud, you see a very transactional sort of thing. If I do A, B will happen. If I do B, C will happen. If I do C, and not recognizing the things that are much greater, much more complex than that, and have many more inputs that are much more difficult. Sometimes, God forbid, they're actually immaterial,
Mm-hmm.
right? As opposed to being material-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And so he didn't write Manifesto for Meaning until the 40s, something like that, the 40s.
Oh, it was written in 1959. Yeah.
1960. So
Yeah.
Freud had gone it. So he had time to digest what he had learned in the experience. I remember Bruno Bettelheim, another who had this whole experience of the concentration camps that came out of so
That's right. That's right.
very heartfelt way about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
That life was more complicated. It was not as mechanistic, that it had come to be believed to be. When they applied what was called, it wasn't actually Newton's idea, but Newton's idea of a clockwork universe became the model. And if I just pull this lever over here, then that'll happen over there, and that's all there is to it. It's very simple. Because there's no meaning, because of these things aren't important, right? Because they're material. As I like to say, I can't find it with my voltage.
Yeah.
Like free will.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's a little thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting to see that whole play out across the generations. He's kind of a new reaction to that, which I think is very much needed.
Yeah.
Told for years, the great Freud, Marx, and Darwin had all undermined the nature of the human person, and that it had anything which was really of value other than the collection of molecules and chemical reactions, right? And we're all just the product of a blind universe that had no idea that we were coming. How could we find meaning? Why would we even bother? And all this stuff.
Yeah, we often refer to Darwin, Marx, and Freud as the evil trinity. And when you think about the enormous impact and influence those three have had for overwhelmingly the worse, and yet it's interesting. Darwin, Karl Marx, and Freud, they all argued that their theories, whether it was theory about politics and history or theory of psychology or whatever, were all based on science. Okay, they weren't just theories or myths or anything like that. And yet, in fact, they're just very secularistic, theories that ultimately totally fail. Yeah.
Great thinkers because they were brilliant, but they never achieved what they were the system they made, they never were able to achieve it. They never, he never got what he wanted through pleasure. Adler never got what he wanted through power. I mean, like that's not science fiction.
They don't satisfy, do they? And scripture is so clear about that none of these things, power and pleasure, they're dead ends, aren't they? And eventually they're so unfulfilling that people are left, in a state of despair. So, okay. Any other thoughts before we move on here? All right, let's take a look at concentration camp psychology. So the issue is for people in the concentration camps, and Frankl had to deal with this constantly. He somehow survived, as I said, 3 years in these human hellholes. And so the question that constantly emerged was, why live? I mean, the conditions are just indescribably horrific. And so why not just end it all? And a lot of people did decide to do just that. Okay. So Frankl survives 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. Have any of you ever been to Auschwitz? Okay, yeah, Paul and Millie I know have. We have. In fact, every time I've gone to Poland, I've gone to Auschwitz. It's a strong dose of reality in the dark side of humanity and human nature. About 90% of people who first arrived in these concentration camps, 90% were immediately sent to the gas chambers, 90%. His mother, his father, his brother, and his wife were all worked to death in the camps, or else they were just sent to gas chambers and their bodies were cremated. Now, he didn't know this until after the war was over. In fact, the thoughts of being, reconciled with his wife, it was a major factor in helping him get through this horrific condition. He couldn't wait for this to end so they could be reunited. But then he finds out, of course, that she's like 95% or more, and that is she did not survive. Frankl describes in detail the inhumane conditions in the camps that were designed to dehumanize people, humiliate them, degrade them, as if they were just animals, just soulless animals. For most prisoners, their spirits were immediately broken, and any attempts to maintain their sense of dignity or concern for other people disintegrated almost immediately. He puts it this way: life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. So whatever was truly in there is what came out in the midst of this horrific suffering people were subjected to. He goes on to talk about 4 stages of psychological reaction. First of all was the initial shock. The thought of suicide, he says, was entertained by nearly everyone. It was born of the hopelessness of the situation. People check in, and of course, they have no idea if they're going to be there a few weeks or months or years. And the odds of surviving are infinitesimally small. So the initial shock, followed by apathy and insensitivity. He says prisoners were subjected to overcrowded and unsanitary barracks, constant hunger, sleep deprivation, rat and vermin infestation, and unrelenting brutality. The guards would sometimes beat people nearly to death just for no reason whatsoever. He says apathy was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. In other words, just deal with it. Reality dimmed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on one task, and that was preserving one's own life. He says this was a kind of emotional death that concentration camp prisoners were subjected to. It was disgust with all the filth, all the stench, the ugliness of the camp, and the insensitivity to the daily and hourly beatings. He goes on to say, like nearly all the camp inmates, I was suffering from edema. I had to look that up. That's some kind of swelling, yeah. He says fluid, yeah. He says, my legs were so swollen and the skin so tightly stretched that I could scarcely bend my knees. I don't know how many months or years this went on. He says, I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks, even if I had had any. Nobody had socks. He says, so my partly bare feet were always wet and my shoes were always full of snow. This, of course, caused frostbite, and every step became real torture. He says, when the last layers of fat had vanished from our bodies and we looked like skeletons disguised in skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour itself. It goes on to say the organism digested its own protein and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. Goes on to talk about the soul destroying mental conflict and the clashes of willpower, which were prevalent in the camps. In general, he says there was also a cultural hibernation in the camp. There were two exceptions to this, and that was the two issues that inmates were eager to talk about in private were politics, in particular the war, state of the war, when is this hell on earth going to end, and religion. He says those were talked about everywhere in the camp almost continuously. So politics and religion, the two things that so many people, don't want to talk about. He says the religious interest of the prisoners was the most sincere imaginable. Most impressive were improvised prayers or services in the various huts. So the apathy and so on. Then he talks about how the next step is bitterness, hostility, and violence. He says everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's friends alive lost all value. Everything was sacrificed to this end. The man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he had previously held. Under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, he goes on to say that people suffer the loss of values. And for many, their existence descended to the level of animal life. It says on the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest or otherwise, even brute force or even theft, and even the betrayal of friends in order to save themselves. So, being treated like animals. He goes on to say that the next step was hopelessness in the midst of all the pain and all the uncertainty. Some just absolutely couldn't bear up. In the midst of the physical and emotional strain and abuse, and many of them lost the will to live. He says some who were religious simply gave up because they believed that a better life, existed in the afterlife. And so they just lost the will to live. He says those of us who survived, knew that the best of us did not survive. The best of us did not return. In other words, there were those who, staunch believers in God, many of them Jews, of course, some perhaps, some Christians and all, who realized, no, I just want to go on and be with the Lord. And so those who survived knew that the best of us did not return. Others hated their situation and their persecutors so much that they preferred to die. He says horrible circumstances give some people the opportunity to grow spiritually, but that's a small percentage, as it tests their inner strength. But most people did not take their lives that seriously, and their life had become meaningless. He says the prisoner who had lost his faith in the future was doomed, and they were just subjected to both physical and mental decay. For the few who struggled to live, the question was why? Why live under these horrific circumstances? Why continue to live in the midst of such degrading and hopeless conditions? And he writes, woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. And it's here where he quotes Nietzsche again. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. Okay. So a few, like Frankl, managed to find meaning and purpose in the midst of all this insanity and brutality. They sought to maintain their humanity and either died or survived, as he says, heroically. He goes on to say, sometimes the situation may require that a man shape his own fate by action. At other times, it calls for serious contemplation. And sometimes man may be required simply to accept his fate and to bear his cross. Interesting comment from a Jew, bear your cross. It says, naturally, only a few people were capable of reaching great spiritual heights, but a few were given the chance to attain human greatness. So a tiny percent, in his view, attain human greatness. So how did he survive in particular? He's one of the relatively few that did. Ironically, his life was spared because he volunteered for medical service in another camp that was infested with typhoid fever. He actually volunteered to do that, go to a camp that was full of typhoid fever. And in retrospect, because of that act of service on his part, ironically, that's how he survived. Near the end of his ordeal, he was asked to address the men in his particular infirmary. And he reminded them that anyone who's still alive has a reason for hope in this life. This is how he puts it. I estimated my own chances of surviving at about 1 in 20, about 5%. But I also told them that in spite of this, I had no intention of losing hope or giving up, for no one knew what the future would bring in the next hour, let alone in the next week or month or whatever. I told my comrades that human life under any circumstances never ceases to have meaning. I said that someone looks down on each of us in this difficult time. It can be a friend or a wife, somebody alive or dead, or it can be God. And he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope to find us suffering proudly, hoping, knowing how to die and die heroically. He says, and finally, I spoke of our sacrifice, which had meaning, even though at the time, I mean, obviously nobody knows why they're being subjected to this horror. He says, in reality, our sacrifice did have meaning. Those of us who had any religious faith could understand this without difficulty, that for some reason, God was allowing them to stay alive when almost everybody else had perished. Although Frankl had 2 opportunities to escape in the final days before the end of the war, he felt that he needed to remain and attend to the patients in the infirmary. So he could have escaped, and he didn't. Okay. On the last day, before the concentration camp was liberated, the SS arranged for the prisoners to be taken to another facility where the Red Cross would take custody of them. So my friend and I, we were standing in the last group from which 13 would be chosen for the next to last truck to leave. The chief doctor counted out the requisite number, but he omitted us 2. The 13 were loaded into a truck and we had to stay behind. We were very surprised, very annoyed, very disappointed, and we blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that, well, he'd been distracted and that's why he didn't choose them to go on the last truck out of the camp. Frankl and his associates spent the night in the abandoned guard room when they were suddenly awakened by gunfire. Then we grasped what was happening, he says. The battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased and morning dawned. Outside on the flagpole of the camp was a white flag that was floating in the wind. In other words, we surrender. Okay. All right. So 2 weeks later, he finds out what happened to those 13 that were loaded on the last truck in those final hours. Quote, Our friends who had thought that they were traveling to freedom, to the Red Cross camp that night, they had been taken in trucks to another camp, and there they were locked into huts and burned to death. Wow. So apparently God believed that he had a purpose in life. And again, as Christians, we look back at his life, his writings and all, and we wish that he had had a relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. He has had a very, very, very positive effect and impact on many, many people's lives, of course. So on a human level, you know, very, very great man who helped probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But as Christians, we realize that it could have been even greater. Any comments before we move on?
What I think about some of the pop stars and the rock stars and the influence they could have for Christians, like Taylor Swift. You know, I mean, her influence would be amazing if she was a Christian. Yeah, I mean, kind of modern day.
Yeah.
She's a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she could reach a lot of people.
And yet, you know, celebrity culture is just almost inherently egocentric, isn't it? And narcissistic, and these people, whatever their quote gift may be, an actor, a great singer, singer-songwriter, whatever the case may be, almost invariably they do feel superior to, you know, the rest of humanity. But you're absolutely right. But how few have ever used their, for lack of a better word, celebrity status for the cause of Christ? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Pamela? Mm-hmm.
Hong Kong, and when we were in Hong Kong, my mother met numbers of people who were in Nazi concentration camp.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing was that the people who were the kind of people that God could use. I don't know who those people are, God knows. And they reached out and reached into the community, whoever was living in these camps. And it was amazing. These people all lived, they went on, they had lives, you know, 20 years, 30 years. They went into these, I mean, some of them, they were German, they went to America, they became part of it in America, and they helped out where they could there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite absolutely amazing. I mean, it wasn't like their religion wasn't telling them do this. I mean, nobody was telling them, but somehow the Lord was speaking to them, and they all served in one form or another. Different kind of service.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they reached into the community. They found something that they could do. They could reach. It was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it is. And you know, adversity in any form can bring out the best and the worst, can't it? And
it can be revealed to people that they don't know why they have been put in this position.
that's right.
But they feel that they've been called to do something, but they don't know exactly what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Eventually they decide they found out, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So I guess in the case of Frankl, he would agree with us that he used basically our terminology. He had a higher purpose, and that's why God had saved his life, whereas 95+% perished. So we're each one individually responsible for how we use that freedom and that gift of life that God has granted us. Yeah. Oh, no, please go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, the people who managed to live, some of them did die. Others, they figured there must be some reason.
Mhm. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Now, Paul?
Reminds me of some of the comments you'll hear or read about people who had a near-death experience. Because he had a near-death
Yes,
experience.
yes.
There's a certain type
He has a
of-
near-death experience. That's a good way to put it.
They find themselves alive, they thought they were gonna die, and then they realized, their life should have a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have sometimes almost a new freedom about the way they live,
Yes,
the way they face the world.
it can be revolutionary, can't it, in some of their lives? Yeah. Mm.
Sometimes they suffer from survival.
That's true.
Ways away from that.
Yeah, that's true.
Not clear how it-
Yeah, and when you consider in these concentration camps how arbitrarily people were murdered, sometimes just on a whim, sometimes because a guard hadn't used his pistol in a few days, and so he wanted to make sure it still worked. So he shoot somebody in the head. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's amazing. All we can say is, why are we right here, right now, as Millie, oftentimes prays, we're here, where God has granted us life right here, right now, for a particular reason and purpose. And when we see our society and culture being so degraded and morally, spiritually, and so on, I mean, obviously, we're here to be a source of true light and love and hope and truth. So let's take that very, very seriously. Yes, Donna.
I think there was Albert Roller was talking this morning, and I know we've all heard this culture of suicide, especially in Canada, this euthanasia, where death by medical assisted. It's now the leading cause of death in Canada, and they keep expanding it more and more. So I'm thinking about these people in these concentration camps who did everything they could to survive in horrific, unimaginable conditions. And you have these people that in our culture, they give up, but they're living the life of luxury, but they have no meaning, right? They say,
Yeah.
he who has a why to live can bear almost any how,
Mhm.
and they have no why.
Mhm.
They have no meaning. They give up, even though they're living what we would call a good life.
Mhm.
So I just can't help but that contrast, just so.
Well, in the cavalier way in which we treat the gift of life from the womb to, the tomb, as we say, Scripture's very clear that God has a purpose for our existence. We have no right to take human life, whether it's, the preborn or people, in their elderly years. And again, there are elderly people we've heard about a lot who are suffering horribly. And in retrospect, it can be one of the most spiritually rich periods of their life. They have to get real about the state of their soul. Mhm. Any other thoughts? Okay, for time's sake here, we've only got about 15 minutes left, so let me uh, go a little bit further in your notes there to the section 3 sources of meaning. That may be another page or so in your notes. Frankl will emphasize that. Oh, by the way, right before this, he quotes Nietzsche again, probably another one of these famous statements that Nietzsche made, and that is, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. Again, even Nietzsche could blunder into truth from time to time. And that's why we say, there's some truth in most every religion and philosophy and so on, but Jesus Christ is the true way, the truth, and the life, of course. So in the concentration camp, stripped of all ego and false dignity, Frankl came to know his true self without any illusions. However, he says the reality is that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Again, he said that so many people just were so degraded and they started acting like animals, basically, because it was all about self, survival, and sometimes at the expense of somebody else. Well, as far as three sources of meaning, he says meaning in life is the result of pursuing things that actually matter. And we know that that's, a relatively small list of things in life. Frankl says, do not aim at success, because success, like happiness, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself. He goes on to say that, again, for time's sake, let me move on here. He says, self-actualization in life, living a meaningful life, can only come through self-transcendence. In other words, giving ourselves to a cause to serve another person or a worthy, again, a worthy cause. So self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. So once we transcend our own ego, then we can actually open ourselves up, our time, our energy, our resources, and our priorities to things that matter more than just our own pleasure, pursuits. Finding one's meaning in life is an unintended side effect of one or more drives. First of all, personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself. And again, Frankl will emphasize that, by the way, that cause greater than oneself has to be a cause in keeping with what is true, what's good, what's beautiful, what's honorable, and what's righteous. Secondly, love for and service to someone else. The greatest of these is love, and love of God, but love of others as well. Thirdly, patient endurance or patient suffering in the midst of an existential challenge or an existential crisis. As one commits his life to a greater cause or to another person, he gains greater peace and joy and meaning in life. Happiness is a byproduct of a greater commitment. We must cultivate a sense of detachment from our own condition and realize that God has granted us life, for the ultimate, and that is to love and serve him and others in the fullest sense. The cue to cure, he says, is self-transcendence, not self-concern or self-absorption. And yet, we live in a society that just, promotes self-absorption, as if that's the key to a meaningful life. And yet, obviously, it's not. Wise people have known that for millennia. Yes, Bruce?
It's sounding more and more like Christianity without Christ.
Yes,
Because I look
that's
back
right.
at 1039,
That's right.
who finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Last first.
And
All servant leader, all over Christianity.
yeah, you're quite right. And of course, only God knows the true state of our soul. And so, we don't know the state of Viktor Frankl's soul up to the point when he died. And we hope and pray that he did turn to Christ. Yes.
Reminds me of, like, when someone goes through a horrible tragedy, like a child's kidnapped and killed, some of those people, certainly not all, I don't know how all respond, but some turn it into like, that's their life's mission then, to help others
That's
and to
right.
prevent that from happening.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It can produce great good ultimately. So you'll see there in your notes, what sustained Frankl during these 3 years? Well, first of all, he says warm thoughts of his wife, constantly thinking about his wife, how much he loved her, how much he was looking forward to them reuniting after this horrible ordeal. Secondly, what sustained him, a great purpose. Thoughts of lecturing someday on the psychology and the life lessons of the concentration camp. And this is a great paragraph that he writes here. Quote, in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of life in a concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to actually deepen. He says, sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered a lot of pain, but the damage to their inner selves was far less. He says they were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. He goes on to say, for hours, I composed speeches in my mind. Eventually, I began to reconstruct the manuscript, which I had lost. He had taken a manuscript with him when he first checked into Auschwitz. Of course, it was confiscated and thrown away. So eventually, he says, he was able to reconstruct what he had written in that manuscript. See, he thought going into the concentration camp that that was his purpose in life, ultimately was to share his insights. And yet it was torn up and thrown away and burned at the very outset. But later he's able to reconstruct it. But listen to this. This is one of my favorite passages. Eventually, I forced my thoughts to turn away from the oppressive trivialities of life in the concentration camp, and I focused on a different subject. Suddenly, I saw myself standing on the platform of a well-lit, warm, and pleasant lecture room. He says, in front of me sat an attentive audience of comfortable upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. By this method, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the suffering of the moment. And I observed them as if they were already of the past. Both I and my troubles became the object of an interesting psychoscientific study undertaken by myself. And so this is what sustained him, and that is this calling that, oh, he wanted to share what he'd learned in these incredibly horrific environments, so he could share the truths he had gained with other people. And by God's grace, he was able to do that, you know. He says, we'll never know until the end of our life what the ultimate meaning of it was. Again, for time's sake, let me move on here. He talks about the greatest of these is love. That's ultimately what we're called, and that is to love God wholeheartedly, to love others as we love ourselves in the true sense. And he says he was sustained by love by focusing on his wife's image. He says, I did not know whether my wife was still alive. I had no means of finding out. But at that moment, it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the source, the strength of my love, my thoughts, and the image of my beloved. Had I known then that my wife was already dead, I think I would still have given myself to the contemplation of her image. We hope and pray that he's been reunited with her. He talks about honest and sincere love for another person. And it brought to mind a quote from Scott Peck in his book, The Road Less Traveled, in which Scott Peck defines love as the will to, in other words, it's an intentionality, the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. It's the best definition of love I've ever encountered. It requires intentionality, acting on your intention, the will to extend oneself, do anything possible for the purpose of nurturing my own spiritual growth and that of everyone else that I come into contact with. Wonderful quote. Yeah, Bruce, and then we'll finish up here real quickly here.
Not the will, it's the actual doing. It's actually defending itself.
Well, that's why he says, yeah.
I can have all sorts of intentions, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, following through on that. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. All right, he makes a few comments on drugs and addictions. He says many people experience an existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness in their life. The connection between drug addiction and alcoholism and meaninglessness would be this. He says, quote, "The drug scene is one aspect of a more general mass phenomenon, namely the feeling of meaninglessness resulting from a frustration of our existential needs, which in turn have become a universal phenomenon in modern societies. People that don't fully realize that God has them here for a much higher purpose. And life is hard. And so it's easy to, quote, drown your sorrows, right? Or inject, something to alleviate your sorrows. People who are constantly unemployed or underemployed face a similar existential crisis. Such a condition is manifest in various psychological disorders, including depression, aggression, and of course, addiction. When unattended, such disorders can lead to drug or alcohol addictions, eating disorders, sexual disorders, sadomasochism, and even suicide. So in the couple of minutes we have remaining here, let me just try and address a couple more points. And this is in the section of your notes, assessments. An antidote to pop psychology. So whatever you think of Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, it shouldn't be classified as pop psychology like so much of Freudianism and Adlerianism might be. Frankl's psychology is antithetical to all the fashionable pop psychology that's so devoid of everything except egoistic self-absorption. And, in our society, self-absorption, that's glorified and celebrated, isn't it? In contrast to those who would deny pain and displeasure, he believes everything and every experience in life is redeemable. Every experience in life is redeemable. Even things when you've purposely disobeyed God's will, we can learn from all of that. It says the purpose in life is to develop inner strength and depth of character based on, once again, commitment to a worthy cause beyond our own ego. Development of a love relationship, ultimately with God, but that would extend to others as well. Patient endurance in the midst of life's trials. Jesus tells us in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, to say the least. John 5:19, in this world, Jesus says, you will suffer many trials. We know we are children of God and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Romans 8:28, In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So the Summa, I would say, would be, and I would tie this in with what I would call Frankl's epiphany. And that is a few days after his liberation from the concentration camp, he takes a walk through the countryside. Birds are flitting about singing, as he says, their joyous songs. He writes, quote, "There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the earth and sky and the lark's jubilation and the freedom of space. I stopped, I looked around, and I looked up to the sky, and then I fell down on my knees. At that moment, I had but one sentence in mind, and it was always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison," he writes. Actually, that's poor translation. It should read, I called out to the Lord from the depths of the pit, and he answered me. He heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. You came near when I called out to you, and you said, do not fear. That's from Lamentations, chapter 3. And he ends by saying, how long I knelt there and repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall. But I do know that on that day, in that hour, my new life began. Step by step, I progressed until I again became a human being. I once again became a human being after all of the dehumanizing experiences he had had. So this is, as I said, a very rich book, and for those of you who have never read it, I think you'd find it to be very, very valuable. And of course, we didn't have enough time to really cover all the great insights in the book. But if you're in a book club and if you have, 2 or 3 hours to process this book, I'd certainly highly recommend it. In your notes that I sent out to you, I did have a few notes related to a follow-up book that Viktor Frankl wrote called Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. And you can see I just included a few points there, but it's also very much a worthwhile book to invest some time and thought into. And so I think I've used all my words. I don't have any other words I know. So any thoughts in closing here? Yes, Bruce?
That we all live in a prison, a cage of our own making, often never realize that the door is open.
That's great.
But you take on all this stuff, it becomes an issue. And that's that idea of him taking that experience that he was in and externalizing it to an idea about what it would be like to talk about this to people in the future. It kind of tames it. Doesn't mean that the next terrible thing they do to you isn't going to hurt you, painful, but it adds to your bucket of story.
Mm-hmm.
Way of separating yourself from it and not being totally mired in it.
Yes, mired is a good word for it. So, we oftentimes live as if this life were just a dress rehearsal for the real show. But this is the real show, isn't it? It's not like when I come back the second time, I'll do it better than I did. This is it. And so by God's grace, he can certainly lead us regardless of our situation up to this present time. He can lead us to true fulfillment in life and truly fulfilling his calling for each and every one of us. So I think this is a really valuable book that doesn't take us all the way. Remember, it didn't take us to Jesus, but we're progressing in that direction. So for that, I'm very thankful for the book. And I'm very thankful for you all. Thank you for being with us, and hope this was insightful. And so next week, we have a lot to look forward to. And that is a presentation on another great book of the 20th century, Philip Reef's The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And Ali is going to do the presentation on the triumph of the therapeutic. So I think everybody has seen the brief synopsis of these various books that I sent out. So read a little bit about the book in that handout, and I think you'll find it extremely valuable. What Ali will be sharing with us next week. So thank you for doing that. Yeah, it takes 2 or 3 hours, doesn't it, to prepare something like that? Or should I say months? So, well, blessings on your evening, the rest of your week, and let's live life as if we seriously want to fulfill our calling and all the opportunities God's provided for us. Amen. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Wonderful having you guys with us. And please don't ever hesitate to enter into the conversation. It's not an interruption at all. In fact, it really enriches our time together. So good to see you, and hope you'll join us again next week as well. Good night.